Hello and welcome back. This is going to be an experiment for a different kind of format, sort of like a stream of consciousness, just free-form thoughts and ideas with some main topics that I have planned to talk about, but not heavily on the visuals, so more like a podcast, I suppose. I don't know if I'll edit out all the ums and ahs and meanderings. More than likely, just so that it's a little bit more digestible. I'm not the best freeform sort of like speaker, I suppose, like on off the cuff kind of speaker. I always have to plan everything, so I don't know how this is going to turn out. But I thought, whilst I'm working on my other videos, my main videos, to keep myself active on YouTube, so that I'm constantly releasing content and not just stagnating, because I'm a known procrastinator, and my previous YouTube channels have never really lasted when I'm in control and I'm doing all the, weekly schedules and like vlogging, for example. When I first tried vlogging back in the early to mid 2000s, I say, well, when did YouTube come out? Like 2004 or 5. I was not regimented and disciplined, and I still kind of am like that still, a little bit sort of can slack off. So I have been pushing myself, because I've got, if you've seen my first video, I do meander a bit about my ideas, and I sort of like get excited. This is what I'm going to be doing, and all that kind of stuff. But in the end, these are tangible projects that I've started and sketched out. Some of them are more closer to finish than others, but I want to be able to knock them off one by one. So after years of time wasting and drifting from idea to idea, because I'm also an amateur indie author. I've written a few things here and there, just short stories. I did one novel on Smashwords, but obviously unedited and full of grammatical errors and spelling errors, etc., which I constantly upload new versions of my book. But I do tend to sort of get distracted, and I come across a new idea and I run with it. So I have set myself a schedule of things that I need to do, and I'm going to try and make it on a weekly basis. But at this moment, I can't promise anything, because obviously I don't really have an audience and I don't know who's watching me. But I'm going to at least do one video a fortnight, and then try to push myself into a more regular once a week kind of thing. But at the moment, it's a bit sort of erratic. My most successful YouTube account, I wasn't predominantly behind the camera. In front of the camera. I was behind the camera, which is localized in the city that I live in. It's sort of like an interview show where my friends and I would go out and interview people at festivals and events and things like that. It's called Ask Brisbane. It's a little bit dated now, and I haven't uploaded anything on there for a while, but it did generate over 4,000 subscribers in the years that I left it dormant. So I think it's mostly the content, because we shot a lot of bizarre events, let's just say. So if you look up Ask Brisbane, so ASK Brisbane, that's my most successful account, even though I haven't uploaded anything in years. So, but I do plan to eventually bring it back in some way or another. But it's not my main focus, because my main focus is my passion, and my passion is writing, and fantasy has always been in my life. Fantasy and sci-fi, but predominantly fantasy. And so, I'd like to just sort of let loose and just talk about my ideas and what I've been doing in the last few weeks since I've fired up this account. This account actually dates back a few years, actually. I did try to get on board with the whole political account kind of thing. But yeah, in the end, it wasn't really something that I wanted to pursue. It was more so that I was opinionated. I wanted to argue with people about my point. And in the end, you know what? We all have different views. And let's just leave it at that. Let's keep it out of this nerdy hobby of ours for a little bit, you know, so we can sort of enjoy the games. So I didn't delete the videos, but I hid them. And because I put a lot of work into the 2 videos that I uploaded, and I thought they were very thoughtful. And there was nothing like them on the internet, so they'll probably stay there for a while until maybe one day I might unmask them again. But yeah, so in the weeks after the first video, I've been scrambling to assemble scripts for each episode and topics I'd like to talk about. Obviously, D&D is a passion of mine. Well, it's the story behind D&D the story behind me being interested in D&D goes back to the 3.5 edition. It was very sporadically introduced to me through my nerdy friends at uni. We did like a few quests here and there, and then I was always busy and stuff. But my passion for role playing goes further back than that. Back to the 80s, actually. I am an old person, older person. Someone who's not, new to the hobby in the sense that 5e was their first intro. Because back in the 80s, I strangely enough didn't play Dungeons and Dragons. I got into role playing through fighting fantasy books, which were very popular in our school that we grew up in. So the library was full of them, and I knew about D&D, but I didn't play it. And then after fighting fantasy, it would have been Warhammer. I got into wargaming a little bit, not as much as I'd like to have done, because I was a young lad with no money to his name. But I did play Hero Quest and Space Crusade, so those two hold sentimental. I have a sentimental attachment to those two games, as well as a few other sort of 80s, 90s kind of games. There's another game that I mentioned in my first video called Ancestral Trail, and it was actually created by a New Zealander, and it was released in news agencies. Do you guys remember news agencies? Back in the day, magazines, they were like monthly released, I think, monthly releases. And it was like a, how would you explain it? It had a story, and you could follow it because it had like a book with scenes, and it was like a progressive story. But there was also like a gaming element to it with the various monsters that you could collect, etc. And it's pretty sad because I really wish that game kept going, and because I'm just trying to think, did it predate? No, it wouldn't have predated Magic the Gathering. Actually, I'm really curious about that now. I am going to check to see, because I know. One second. This is very off the cuff kind of stuff, but I'm just going to have a look. So Magic the Gathering. Let's have a look. What does Wikipedia say? It started in 1993. And let's look at Ancestral Trail game. 1992. Wow. I mean, they're not the same game. They just share a similar spirit, as in like you collect all these monsters and yeah, they were in magazines, but it's still, it feels like it. Actually, they did have cards. Yeah, of course they had cards. What am I talking about? I'm looking at them right now. I'm Googling it right now. So if you have Google in front of you, which I'm sure you do, look up Ancestral Trail with the word game after it or something like that, and then go to images and you'll see the cards and the magazines. So it was a year before Magic the Gathering. That's crazy. You're hearing it first if you're listening to this video. The Kiwis have been always one step when it comes to fantasy. Well, I mean, obviously Lord of the Rings wasn't created by Peter Jackson, but, you know, he did make the best trilogy of all time. So anyway, a bit of sidetrack there, but yeah, my early role-playing fantasy game kind of stuff came back started in the 80s with Fighting Fantasy and Hero Quest. I think I might be thinking now. I'm going on a checking the years of releases, because maybe Hero Quest wasn't the 80s. Maybe Hero Quest was early 90s. Let's have a look. But Fighting Fantasy definitely. Hero Quest, yeah, no, 89. So it would have been, yeah, like it was the late 80s that I got into fantasy when I was a wee lad in a small country town. And yeah, like I said, I didn't play Dungeons & Dragons. I knew of it. I'd seen the cartoon also sometime later. I knew of Dungeons & Dragons. I knew what it was about, but I just never, I don't know why. I never hunted it down, looked for groups that played it. I guess I was a bit of a loner kid, and hence the library and solo role-playing, or game books. Because I also did the whole Pick a Path adventures, which didn't have a role-playing or fighting element to it. But the reason why I'm going down this road to talk about my passion with fighting fantasy, and obviously some old video games like King's Quest and Dragon Wars, which was released by the people who did Bard's Tale. Now, I never played Bard's Tale. I know that it was super popular at the time, but I played I came in when they released Dragon Wars, and then I introduced it to a friend, and he goes, "Oh yeah, no, you should play the first games. Is it Interplay? I can't think of the company, but." He was like, my friend was like, you should play Bard's Tale, and I looked at it, I was like, oh man, it looks just like Dragon Wars, and he's like, well, these are the creators, and they this is the first game that they made. So, but anyway, Dragon Wars, King's Quest, Fighting Fantasy, and Hero Quest and Space Crusade. Those were my early introductions, and a lot of comic books like Judge Dredd and all that kind of stuff. But the reason why I bring up that I was introduced to fantasy via fighting fantasy is because it influenced how I view certain monsters in the Dungeons and Dragons mythos. Now, this all makes sense in a minute, but what I'm trying to get at is that fighting fantasy, their monsters, obviously they had similar monsters because they were fans of Dungeons and Dragons, and actually Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone, who created Games Workshop, and they created Fighting Fantasy Games Workshop, which released Warhammer. They, in the early days, Gary Gygax used those guys in England, because they're from England, Peter Jackson and Ian Livingstone, and used their company to release Dungeons and Dragons over there when it was a new thing, when Dungeons and Dragons was first like a commercial product. So Their bestiary for fighting fantasy, and I guess because they're the spiritual ancestors of Warhammer, their bestiary had similar monsters. I believe they had rip-off versions, like not rip-off, like they had certain iconic Dungeons and Dragons monsters, but they had their own name for it. For example, the Illithids, or the Mine Flayers, they were called Mine Slayers in fighting fantasy. They had Dark Elves. They didn't have Drow, so Dark Elves are, I guess, interchangeable with Drow. So technically they did, but they just called them Dark Elves. They had, I'm trying to think of it. They had various monsters that were similar, like the Rust monster. They had a copy of that. Oh man, like I'm having a mind blank. But literally, when I was going through the Out of the Abyss, which is like the monster manual for Dungeons and Dragons, but in the fighting fantasy world, it's called Out of the Abyss. And I think there's been a few sequels since, released by other publishing companies, because Peter Jackson and Ian Livingstone, they still do fighting fantasy occasionally, but they're not as dedicated as they were back in the early days when they were making like heaps of money out of their IP. But yeah, see, I get lost in tangents and I don't know where I was going with that, but I do know that, like I said before, they were taking ideas from Dungeons and Dragons and they created their own versions of it. Well, one thing is they did things differently from Dungeons and Dragons. So even though they had similar monsters and they had the Orcs and Goblins and Giants and the various Giants and etc., their racial genealogy, or their what's it called, the monsters' history and racial history was slightly different. Now, this is where I'm bringing up my first point that I've written here that I should talk about, is that their Orcs and Goblins are racially related to ogres, trolls, gremlins, and a few other sort of monsters, or goblinoids, I guess you would call them in Dungeons and Dragons speak, or in Warhammer you call them greenskins. But in Dungeons and Dragons, ogres and trolls are part of the giant that's right, and Cyclops. Cyclops is part of the orc family as well. And in Dungeons and Dragons, Cyclopses are part of the Ordning, or the giant family. And gremlins are part of the Fae. But in fighting fantasy, gremlins, like I said just before, is part of the goblinoid race. So when I was young and I was just reading fighting fantasy, my influences came from there. So when I wrote my own, because my brother and I, we took ideas from fighting fantasy and we wrote our own system, our own TTRPG called Sword and Magic. Oh, it's pretty lame, but it was using the same kind of system. So there was the D6 system. So 2 dice plus that to your skill, and you just have to beat your opponent, and then they lose stamina, and depending on stamina is like hit points, and depending on the strength of the weapon, how much you lost. And our armor system was like soaking damage, so it was almost like a second layer of hit points. And then when it got down to 0, your armor's just fucked, like it's like shattered or broken or whatever. Which I think fighting fantasy and advanced fighting fantasy, they don't use that style with armor. I have the advanced fighting fantasy book. I just haven't read the rules in a while, but yeah, we made it like an extra pool of hit points armor, and you'd have to repair it to restore it back to its original pool, so to speak. But the races that we took and we ran with were from fighting fantasy. So for years, yeah, like I wrote all this mythos, this my fictional fantasy world using the ideas from that system. So anyway, recently I sat around, as I do, getting distracted by shinies, and I fired up Midjourney, and I started to create some of the monsters from my childhood, from the 80s and the 90s, out from our system, Sword and Magic, and our own sort of, because we used to play, my brother and I would play and pretend to be, these heroes fighting. So we even created our, man, we were pretty inventive. You become very inventive when you're in a small country town with nothing to do, especially in the 80s. So we made our own board game as well. We made, like, when we played Hero Quest. See, we were copycats. We would copy and then make our own version of it, because we were like, well, what if it had this and that? And that's why we made Sword and Magic. And then but that was years later. The first thing we made was like a rip-off version of Hero Quest, and we used cardboard cutouts. Like, we'd draw the monsters and we'd cut them out and then stick them up on, I think it was blue tack, or we stuck them or glued them onto a base of cardboard so they could sit flat on the table. And we made our own dungeons, and we drew all the lines, so it was a quad. It was crazy. Like, we were so creative back then. And so our racial history came from those books that we read. So anyway, as I was sitting in front of Midjourney, I was just creating creatures, and then I was like, you know what? I'm going to create a bestiary for my childhood, for the monsters that I created with my brother. And we had our own sort of racial history. So I want to sort of spend a bit of time talking about that. Whoever's listening, if you find it interesting, if not, then that's fine. Skip through it. Wait for the next video if you want to if you want to see the next video. But yeah, we created this sort of family tree of these sub-races of Orcs and Goblins, and we wanted a name for it. So we decided to go, and I don't know why, I don't know what initiated this, but we chose the word hob, H-O-B, which is also another word for elf or pixie or sprite or something. And thus, you got hobgoblins and etc. And it might have come from that, but hob just sounded like what you would imagine an orc or a goblin, etc. to be. And then we just made all these other races, sub-races of the overarching hob species. So instead of calling them goblinoids or calling them greenskins or orcs and goblins, we called them hob, which was an umbrella term for that race, and kind of like humans, that sort of the tribes drifted apart across the continents of the world and evolved into different sort of versions of the human with different color skin and eyes and different ethnicities, etc. And that's how we envision the hobs to be. There was like a proto race that came much later, though. We didn't have that back then, but recently in the last few years I sort of dwelled on it and thought the proto race would be the hobgoblins, and that they call themselves hobs, but goblin was an insult or some kind of derogative term that humans sort of slapped on them, or maybe it was a human, like a common word for the common language. I'm using D&D speak, but like the human language, it was a word to mean something about their tribe, maybe goblinar or something. Maybe it came from another word, but anyway, they tacked that onto it. And then from the hobgoblins, which I envisioned, and my brother as well, we spoke about it. We envisioned them as these tall, sort of almost human height kind of creatures, very sort of skinny and gaunt, sort of plainsman kind of thing, like they running long distances and also dwelling in sort of heavy forested areas, more nomadic, tribal, very sort of shamanistic and very druidic. Not specifically evil per se, and then from them the other races would evolve or devolve depending on the regions that they move to. The Orcs, being the prominent subspecies of the hobs, moved into a land that had been decimated during, I'm going into my fantasy sort of history here, but I'm not going to like name drop locations and stuff like that. This is just more to get an idea or a grasp of where I'm sort of coming from. But there's a god war, and this area was blasted into smithereens and had some kind of chaotic energy in the ground, in the land, and sort of like not deformed, but it made creatures change racially into more bestial versions of themselves. So the hobgoblins who moved into that area became more bestial, larger, and more strong and warlike, more driven to war more from the chaotic energies in that region, and that they would be the Orcs, the first of the destructive element of the hob race. And then I made the Goblins. They were hobgoblins that moved into the mountains and into the caves, and they became smaller because of the small spaces they moved in, and built their tribal sort of structures, their villages and their kingdoms under the mountains. They sort of came into conflict with dwarves, because dwarves obviously live under the ground as well. And then gremlins came from them, who moved further deeper down and became even smaller because the tunnels got shorter and shorter, and they became more with dark vision. And with gremlins, I also kept that mythos that they are mechanically minded and destructively mechanically minded, but I sort of added a bit more sort of nuance to it, in the sense that they steal technology from the gnomes, who are about their height as well, and you build their own war machines. And then actually, I'm not going to go because I've got so many sub-races of the hob species. But actually, speaking of that, I'm going to drop a PDF in the link below. So if you've gotten this far into my meandering and you want to have a look visually at some of the ideas, I've got a what do you call it? There's a term, flavor. I have a flavor document for you to see what we envisioned hobs to be, and I've got a few sub races there. Some of them from the D&D fighting fantasy sort of world, as well as some homebrew monsters that I created back then as well, that I've sort of brought back. Ogres were orcs that moved up into the mountains and got even bigger. I removed the stupidity factor from ogres because I wanted them to be brutish, but I wanted them to be more like generals, like leaders of armies, and the only kind of race that could sort of whip the orcs into shape and command them you had to be bigger and tougher. So they were just large orcs, basically. They grew bigger and they became mountain climbers and basically mountain orcs, but they evolved into what we would know as ogres. There's satiable hunger, which is a part of the D&D mythos, and a few others like Warhammer, I think. Yeah, Warhammer, and even World of Warcraft. I think their ogres are big, fat, white dudes. I think. I think I'm looking back now, and I'm remembering a picture from I think it was Warhammer, and the ogres were like these big, sort of like pale-skinned behemoths, part of the giant family, who just love to eat. And it's not like that in my world. In my homebrew, my ogres are they're not super intelligent, but they're just not dumb, and they don't just eat. Ogres do have a bigger appetite because they're bigger creatures, but and then the trolls. I'll touch on some of these basic races, and then sort of you can read the rest in that document. But the trolls went with the goblins and the gremlins into the mountains, and some of them into the swamplands, and they dug deeper underground. But they were caught by dark elves, actually, down in the depths of the, I guess you could call the Underdark or the Underworld, or and the dark elves used their power, their magic, chaotic magic, demonic magic, to corrupt these hobs and turn them into slaves, I suppose, but also like a kind of like an elite force of fighting, basically just used for labor and fighting. Basically, that's it. Maybe not elite in the sense of that they were like expert fighters, but more so like the shock troops that they would send in, or the front line. Because I have it in my world that the Dark Elves were very good at. Well, actually, I think it's in D&D as well. They capture a lot of races and use them for various things like labor. I know slavery is a very, very bad word and term and idea to use, and I know Wizards of the Coast is distancing themselves from that, and so is Star Wars. Like there's all that controversy which I won't go down, but they are slave masters in this world. They're evil, and I associate slavery with evil. So I'm not propping it up as a, and I would never run a game if people felt uncomfortable with slave races, obviously, because this is my opinion, and you can disagree, and that's fine. That you want to have these horrible antagonists that you hate because they're doing things that are not considered compassionate, civilized, moralistic, any of that kind of stuff. You want your enemies to be, something that you can't stand to look at. I know that the complicated villain. See, I'm sidetracking again. I should be talking about Hobbes, but I know that the complicated villain, or the shades of grey villain, is very popular now, and I think there's a bit of a kickback against that now, actually, with games like SHADOWDARK and various other sort of grittier games are coming out, and there's a lot of YouTubers or dungeon tubers I've seen talking about how they want their baddies to be bad, and I'm not going to get into that debate either. I actually like complicated villains as well, and I have a lot of right now I'm running a 5e campaign, and the main antagonist, she is a complicated character. She's evil for necessity needs for her people, but that doesn't mean that I wouldn't run a game with just a maniacal maniac who just wants to invade and murder nations. I like both. I like both. I like chocolate and vanilla. So I don't limit myself to just one sort of way of thinking. Because if you do that, you sort of, I don't know, you miss out on a few things. But anyway, the Dark Elves created the trolls from the hob stock that were under the mountains and made them bigger. They got bigger. Not as big as ogres, but they're the step up from orcs in size and bulk. They're quite big. And then there was a few other sub-races that the Dark Elves created. I did the winged gremlins, which became familiars of the Dark Elves, and they were basically the gremlins who got captured as well as they were burrowing deeper into the Underdark, and they were shrunk in size by the Dark Elf mages because they wanted to have familiars. They wanted to have spies and creatures to help them in their labs, in their laboratories. And they became, I call them critters. So like how I came up with critters, and my brother hates the name critters to use as one of the monsters, but I've listed them as critters, brackets, winged gremlins. And I'm fairly certain Dungeons and Dragons has a variety of gremlins. Mites, I think some of them are called. And there's synids or I'm having a mind blank, but yeah, there's a whole family of gremlins, but I don't have those races in my world. So it's just gremlins and critters, which are winged gremlins. But Fighting Fantasy has winged gremlins, and so does Dungeons and Dragons. So sidetrack again. How I got Critters is the horror movie Critters. So I was like thinking, oh, Gremlins, yeah, like from the movie Gremlins. And then I thought of winged gremlins, and I was like, just calling them winged gremlins is kind of, I don't know, it's just a bit of a mouthful. And I mean, it does have a cool flavor to it though. Like it makes you think of like a little bat-like winged gremlin sitting on your shoulder, or sitting on the shoulder of like a necromancer or warlock. But I wanted to give them a name for their species, so I like the horror movie Gremlins, and with Gremlins, and then the horror movie Critters, I just like, they're critters. So yeah, excuse me. So yeah, and then the Cyclops. The Cyclops used to be ogres, and so when the orcs left some of the orcs left the sort of chaos realm, and they moved up into the mountains and became ogres, and then some of those ogres were captured by dark elves as well. So the ones who created the trolls and the critters, they took the ogres and experimented on them, and they were trying to give them sort of like a seer kind of power, so ability to read the future, see into the future, and the ability to sort of astral travel, like via sleep and all that kind of stuff, like deep meditation, to be able to spy on their enemies. And they thought the ultimate spy would be able to predict and also invade the thoughts of the enemy's generals, so that they could read what their moves are going to be. And so that's another thing. Dungeons & Dragons, Cyclopses are dumb as fuck. I'm fairly certain Fighting Fantasy, I could be wrong if they're stupid. I'm not 100% sure. But my Cyclopses are deep thinkers. They are moody, deep thinkers, solitary creatures like ogres, but they're smarter than ogres, and they have these sort of subtle psionic powers. So they're not stupid, and they are, I guess, if you can imagine this, a very sort of emotionally deep thinkers, like sort of like melancholy kind of thing. And there's two influences that come from my Cyclopses. The first one is, if you've seen the movie Krull, there's a Cyclops in there, and I stole the idea of foresight and seer vision from them. And supposedly in the Krull myth, their Cyclops can predict their own death. They see their own death, so they know when it's coming. And I took that idea as well from my Cyclops. And the second one is kind of an odd one. Conan the Barbarian. Like, you'd think Conan is dumb. He'd have a high wisdom. He's not stupid, but he's very intuitive. He's like that. Yeah, pure wisdom, I'd say. Brawns, obviously. Yeah, it's Conan the Barbarian, for God's sake. But that sort of, because I'm trying to think of Robert E. Howard when he said that Conan had melancholy. I can't remember what was it? I gotta look this up. I'm in front of Google. Conan. And what does it say? Here it is. Hither came Conan the Cimmerian, black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet. Yeah, gigantic melancholies. That's that line inspired me. Inspired me to give the hulking Cyclopses a little bit more depth to their character. So they are the basics of the race. And then there's a whole slew of others, like even ones that I not reskinned, just retooled a bit, changed some of it, like the bugbears. Yes, they're more hairier. They look like the same kind of bugbears in D&D, kind of, but I gave them a reason why they're hairy. They were hobs. They were like the hobgoblins and the orcs, etc. But they gave themselves up in worship to one of the gods of the undead, one of the dark gods, the werewolf king, and thus they were given the ability to be lycanthric, being able to shapeshift. So that's not in D&D lore, but that's in my lore. So I try to uniform my races and give them reasons for why they look like they look like. Why they look like they do. And but yeah, so anyway, if you want to look at my ramblings, my ideas, the PDF is in the description below. I will also be creating a book out of this later on because I'm going to stat them up and I'm going to create more monsters because at the moment I've got, oh God, I haven't even got the document open right now. I should really open that document so I can see what I've, SUBRACES, here we go. Let's fire it up. So, forward. Yeah, it just talks about where I got my influences from and where the hobs came from. And then we go into the major races. Yeah, so the hobgoblins, which are the progenitor race. Then the orcs, goblins, gremlins, critters, trolls, which have the regenerative features from D&D, Fighting Fantasy, which is why the Dark Elves genetically engineered them to have regen abilities so that when they were pulling their siege weapons or building their fortresses underground, that when they got damaged or injured, etc., they could reform themselves. So they wouldn't need workers' compo. Cyclops, yep. And then the ogres, which are the leaders. Minor sub-races, the bugbears, which I mentioned before. They worship the god of werewolves. And then we got the kobolds, which I don't make them dumb little silly like lizard squeaks who want to, be big dragons, but they're trapped in a little body. Made them a bit more vicious looking. So if you look at the PDF, my image that I generated is a bit more uglier. They're small, so they're of the same stock as gremlins, so they would be roughly the same size as a kobold. But they were also genetically... So I'm going through my notes now. They were also genetically formed from the Dark Elves. Yeah. You got to hear they were crossbred with lizard men. So they were. That's their origin. The Dark Elves captured lizard men because they used them in their armies as well, and then they crossbred genetically lizard men with the hobs that were living in the mountain and created the kobolds. Then I got a few other creatures here. Some of them, the names from myth. I don't know if they're D&D lore, but like the Bugaboo, Boggarts, and Boggles. Those 3 Bs. But I've created my own versions of them and what they are. And then I've created my own other races like the Mog, the Goon, and the Hooligal, the Hooligans, which I think is pretty cool. These are really sick. The Red Cap Goblins, which were the race of goblins that sort of pulled the initial goblins away from worship of their old gods to worship demons and the dark gods. And then another cool one that I created, which looks like a hybrid of a goblin and a harpy, called Dirge Howlers. Yeah, I went pretty crazy. Like I love this art. Hey, like I'm going to release them with stats, and I'm going to SHADOWDARK them up. Only because, I've got too many ideas, and SHADOWDARK is easy to create monsters from. I'm going over Kelsey's video on creating monsters and the book as well, but I just don't want to spend too much time if I'm going to pump out a bajillion monsters, because I want to eventually release a book, full book. So it'll have all this, what you see now in the PDF will be in it, but there'll be more. And I'll try to have, I don't know, like 100 or 200 variants of hobs, and stat them up, give them some lore, how you would interact with them. Try to be a bit vague, maybe historically with their realm, where they're from, so that you can sort of drop them in your own world. Or I could just put in, because Drakand is the name of the Orc nation, which is that chaotic land I was telling you about that's been seeded by dark magic. But yeah, I'll release this at some stage, because it's so easy to pump out these designs. And yes, this is another controversial thing, AI art, which you can debate me if you want. No, I don't mind. I can see both sides of the fence, but I think I'm going to use it. I'm going to continue to use it because it's helping me immensely. But I won't argue about that. That's another video for another time. But I was looking at the monsters in the SHADOWDARK Dungeon Master book, and yeah, stats fit on one like little section of the page. So I'm going to go crazy with my ideas, because this is just scratching the surface. I've got other hob-like races. I should probably try to create other races, but I think that if I release books that are specific to a sort of like a genre, like a particular race, then instead of trying to have like retreading old ground and just having like a bestiary that looks like the monster manual, I'd rather choose a race and then just make variants of it, or I'd rather create my own races. And I have a whole bunch of my own races, which I'll eventually release too. But this is going to be one of my major focus points, I think, in the coming weeks. And I think I'm going to use this to learn how to create for SHADOWDARK, because the plan is, and if you're with me this far, thank you for listening. I mean, even if you're just one person. And if not, that's fine. I don't mind talking to myself. But this is going to help me when it comes to creating the campaign setting for Hellhaven, which is going to be my first official proper SHADOWDARK supplement. I guess if I'm making the hob one, it is a supplement. It's very narrow narrow vision sort of thing. But the Hellhaven setting is a setting, so it's got like a lot of location pieces, a lot of sort of like there'll be quests in there. I'll put in like a quest or two. There'll be a bestiary of my own demons. There'll be unique items and stuff like that. And I also plan, when I do create Hellhaven, I plan to do it with my brother and another person who I'm friends with who is a creative type, and yeah, him and I just bounce ideas off each other all the time. I've yet to come to him with this idea yet. He doesn't even know I have this YouTube channel. So, yeah, but I'm going to be doing that soon. I'm going to create a little collective so we can create this content. And that's my plan for this year is Hellhaven. Next year, I'll do some of the other ones like the Street Tribes and a few other ones that I'm working on as well. Let's go back to my notes, because this is going on for quite some time now. Wow, it's almost an hour. I'll try to wrap this up soon. Yeah, so as you know, Hellhaven, that's the second talking point. Third talking point was to discuss Hammer of Hate, my Fighting Fantasy fan quest book. It's steam rolling ahead. I have been working on it in the last week. I had COVID last week, so I had nothing else to do. So I just sat in front of Google Documents and kept writing. I'm doing it because I've always wanted to make a pick a path fighting book, but also because I want to eventually make my own quest books, my own solo quest books, and I want to know how to do it properly. So I want to use this as training to sort of like get familiar with how to pace paragraphs and to move the player from page to page and like how to put in when to put in certain things like instant death pages or combat, or how often should combat be in, or do you give the player the ability to backtrack or things like that. So Hammer of Hate, which is looking cool, by the way. Like, I have to go through and fix up some of the pictures though, because I want it to feel like you're reading a Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone book. So I want to be a lot of familiar similar aspects that will bring back nostalgia when you're playing it. So it's going to be free. I'm going to release that on here and I'll spam all the Fighting Fantasy Facebook groups. But yeah, I've been sitting on this idea for years now. Thing is now that I've got all these tools like Midjourney, and I've got Incarnate, and I've got a few other web apps and stuff that I use now, and this platform, I'm going to just go hell for leather, and I'm going to pump out all my ideas that I've had over the years, over the decades, and I just want to go crazy, hey? Like, I just want to pump it all out, see what hits, what sticks, throw them up against the wall, see what sticks, but I also, at the end of the day, I just want to create. So even if I have an audience of like 5 people or less, that's fine. 5 people downloaded my ebook and said, I can't wait for the next one, I'd be happy. I'm not trying to compete with the big guys. I'm a nobody, but I want to get my ideas out there. I want to have my thoughts on the internet to outlive me. Eventually, I'd like to get back into writing, like full proper book writing. But at the moment, I'm on this role-playing binge, and I want to get it all out. I will eventually go back to my books, because I've got a plethora of ideas. All my old stories that have been archived for decades, like some of them 20 years old or older, much older, back to when I was like a little kid. Some of them just stick with me. But I will get into my writing once I get a flow, once I get a rhythm, and I get a regular release of my creative endeavors. Then I will sort of like work out how to get back into various things that I need to get done, like my novel. I've got a lot to catch up on. And so that's pretty much it. Oh, sorry, I have one last talking point if you're still with me. I'm looking now, and we're clocking over almost an hour. Yeah, we're like almost 5 minutes left, and we're hitting the red. So Google Slides, yeah. Let's talk about Google Slides. I've been fucking around with that for a little bit more now. And I mean, it's not as if you saw my video on it, it is still a bit clunky. But yeah, I've realized that I could create a self-contained quest, and you don't need to have a VTT. You don't need to have, like, I found a Google document that a D&D fan made for your character sheet. So you just plug in your stuff, and it has the mathematics in some of the cells. So it works out all your skills and stats, which is amazing. So this is going to be a purely Google run experience. So what I plan to do, and this is another thing to go on the pile of things to do. I've created the map. It's done. I did it in 2 weeks because I've been busy with other stuff. But I created a map, an orc stronghold called Bloodtooth Mountain. So the module, or the one-shot quest, it's a one-shot. It's called Escape from Bloodtooth Mountain. And I was going to just release the assets, a PDF file with the Dungeon Master notes and the map. So you could have all the tokens, the map, and then just read the PDF and set it up into whatever VTT. And I might still do that eventually. But I wanted to test something just crazy because I want to break the mold. I want to do something that no one else is doing on YouTube. And I don't think anyone is doing what I'm doing. It's just crazy shit. But I want to release a folder, like a Google document folder, and you just, it's plug and play. You just go in, you open up the slides, the map's there. There'll be 2 slides. There'll be one where it'll show you where everything should go or where everything is. And then you open up the game one where you invite the players in. Like I said before in the previous video on Google Slides, the only downside is the rights of the player, like the editing rights. That's still a bit of a problem because if you give them editor, then they can delete Fog of War and stuff like that. And you don't really want to do that. But if you're just doing it, you're controlling the tokens, or like I said before in the video, you can give them editor rights so they can move their token and then you can switch it back to viewer and they lose that right. How quick that is, I don't know. You might have to refresh the browser or something. Maybe they'll try and then it won't work. I've yet to test that yet, but if that works, then I'll put a supplement video to show Dungeon Masters how to use slides. But you can plug in the Google Documents for the character sheets. And so you can plug that in and then you can have an intro, like in the slides, you can have the first slide to show to the players and it's just like a video or an intro. And then you can cut to the second slide and you can play on the map. And then, you know, you can cut to other slides for interludes or anything like that. It's just a funny, quirky idea that I want to sort of run with just to see what happens. And maybe in time, I might be able to find ways to get around the little problems. But yeah, that's something I'm going to release probably next month maybe. Or, oh no, yeah, it would have to be because I have to actually create the tokens, which is not hard because I just AI it and then I just put them through the token stamp app and then just pump them out. But I just need to get the rooms sorted. I've created the whole map, the whole dungeon map. It's just that I need to create the scenes and populate the rooms with the various monsters. But yeah, probably next month. I'll release Escape from Bloodtooth Mountain next month, and just see how you go. Like what if anyone picks it up and plays it and see if they like it, or if they think it's a bit weird because it's not using a proper VTT and it's not using a D&D Beyond for the character sheets. Like I even thought about maybe just because it's so simple, maybe just creating pre-made characters. And so it's a cookie cutter one shot, ready to roll, ready to work. So you could take this to any game and just ask people who've never played D&D to choose a character, and then they can edit it, or you can edit their sheets or whatever, and you can just play it straight from Google Docs and Google Sheets. Yeah, it's just a funny quirky thing, but yeah, no, I personally use Owlbear Rodeo. I haven't used Fantasy Grounds or Roll20 or the most popular one, which I'm having a mind blank. Come on, guys! I know this is not live streaming, and I can't ask for help. What was it? Roll20. Foundry. How can I forget? Foundry is the most popular. Well, the growing. I think Roll20 had the biggest lion's share of players, but I think Foundry is fastly becoming, because it's far superior from what I've seen. YouTubers talking about it, and I don't really know much about Fantasy Grounds. It's just I've seen some videos on that as well, but they're the main ones. But yeah, so that's my ramblings for tonight. I talked about the hob species. So it's my version of greenskins and goblinoids and whatever subcategory, because I always felt like they never had a proper name for their collective, like goblinoids. You're a goblinoid. It doesn't sound like elves or dwarves. Goblinoid. and I'm sure an orc doesn't want to be called a goblin. And what else did we speak about? We spoke about my main focus for the year, which is Hellhaven. That's my main focus, 100%, putting all my energy into that. All these other things like the fighting fantasy novel or fighting fantasy book, and the Google Slides contained one shot. These are just little quirks that I find myself sort of doodling, just wasting time and doing it, but not wasting time. I am creating something that I enjoy. But my main focus this year is to get my brother and my friend together and to go at it with this Hellhaven. But the funny thing is, we're all new to SHADOWDARK, so maybe I should do a SHADOWDARK campaign and we play it first before we create the supplement, because you can't, why make a supplement for a game that none of us know nothing about? We've seen some. I watched this YouTuber who plays SHADOWDARK, and I love it. It just harkens back to that. It's like fighting fantasy, gritty, black and white artwork. Like, if you look at a fighting fantasy novel, it looks like you're looking at a SHADOWDARK monster picture, stat block or something. So, I'm going to start working on my next proper video sometime this week. Should be out next week. Don't know when. Or the week after, who knows, because I'm doing this fortnightly thing. But it's going to be on action economy. Always wanted to do one, and I came across a cool graphic, and I wanted to sort of delve into that. So, anyway, guys, that's it for tonight. And this is an experiment. So I'll do another. What's it called? Daydreams and Dawdles. I might as well do them every week. Something to talk about, just to ramble. Whether it's about where I'm going with my ideas. I think I'll do that. Every week I plan to do a Daydreams and Dawdle podcast. This is me sitting in front of the computer, talking shit to this microphone. Thanks for listening, and please comment, subscribe, like the video, thumbs down the video if you think it's crap. That's fine, you won't hurt my feelings. If you're keen to know more about my monsters and races and stuff, and you want to be I was actually thinking about creating an email list at some stage, a subscriber list, but hey, I'm not big enough yet for that. But I eventually probably will, so I can just spam whoever wants to know my ideas. But anyway, I hope you enjoy that PDF, and I shall talk to you I was going to say tomorrow, but no, I'll talk to you next week. Bye.